Good evening. Thank you to all of you for turning out on what is a fairly rubbish evening. I do appreciate that. There's really no need whatsoever for that slide. It's merely a gratuitous reminder that in fact Melbourne is nothing like Manchester. Certainly not on today's weather. More seriously, just gives me a little bit of an interlude in order to thank Helen and her colleagues here at MMU for organising and hosting this evening, so thank you for that, Helen. Also an opportunity to thank my own university, RMIT in Melbourne, who have funded this visit, and I'll say a little bit about that in a second, and also my former birth, the York Management School at the University of York, who generously, if probably rather incredulously, gave us a little bit of pump priming funding in order to make the film in the first place. I still don't think they actually know what they funded, but the less said about that, the better. What's my reason for being back in the UK? I'm here really to scope possibilities for a new project, really to examine the consumption, if you like, of popular leisure and recreation, and a focus on the role of clubs in the lives of working people, both across a region of Australia and here in the north of England up to the modern era. And to that end, I've been in one of the film archives in the city today. Okay, to make a start. What were our motivations for making this, or undergoing this experiment? I ought to say that I've decided to put some notes down here because it suddenly occurred to me, I don't usually do that, but I got a bit scared on the plane coming over. It's rather a long flight and therefore you get quite scared. And it suddenly occurred to me that the potential for the audience was this. Half of you are probably better climbers than me, who have been climbing for longer than me, so I can't bullshit there. And certainly half of you are far better Deleuzian scholars than I am, and therefore I can't bullshit there either. So I thought I'd try and stick to the script a little bit, certainly when matters get technical, so please excuse me for that. Anyway, we took some of our inspiration to begin with from Deleuze and Guattari's reference to Nietzsche at the beginning of What is Philosophy, which is to say, he says, we must not merely purify and polish concepts, but first make and create them, present them, and to make them convincing. In fact, I guess we've taken him quite literally. Second, what we're trying to achieve by doing this. I guess the first thing to say is that we were concerned with the relationship between re and decoding and re and deterritorialisation, but simply between control and freedom in our contemporary world. Now, I realise there's no such thing as totally decoded flows, there's no absolute escape. In this pursuit, we might fail and simply destroy ourselves, a kind of vociferous nihilism, perhaps drug taking are a good example here. And therefore, in our attempt to negotiate the world around us, we have to be quite careful. Deleuze and Guattari say every coding regime is related to a territory. They give an historical account of its development. First, the primitive territorial machine. Organisation here is according to a particular social context. It's characterised by a relatively low efficient of coding. In a certain sense, it's anti-central organisation. There's only local organisation of limited or soft coding. Second, they talk about the black hole of the despot, where all coding becomes focused on a single point, the monarch, the ruling family or caste, in pre-modernism or the modern state, which attempts to capture and regulate everything at once. Everything gets sucked in toward it. Third, and quite different, is capitalism, of course. Now, coding is not imposed on a territory or a community from without, but from within. Do more, buy more, be an X-Factor star, etc., etc. I guess I'm also talking here, or thinking here, about climbing magazines, which these days seem to me to A, have gone up a great deal in price, and B, to contain more advertisements than they do actual articles on climbing. But capitalism perpetually exceeds its own limits. This prompts the need for regulation. In global finance, the states had to step in. In Manchester in the 90s, lots of illicit evening raves had been turned into a more managed urban clubbing experience. And also the proliferation in the last 30 years, 20 years certainly, of kind of lifestyle sports and the proliferation also of, for example, a lot of indoor climbing centres. So, as much to say that these are more rather than less highly regulated spaces. Deleuze and Guattari also outline the opposition between the states of space which are distinguishable in principle, but are in fact a mixture or a complex interplay. The term they use is striation, or the structuring of space. For example, the gridding of a map. I'm sure we've all seen that example. Deleuze and Guattari give a number of other examples. I guess as we're in Manchester, their example of the construction, or the difference in construction between fabric and felt works quite well. Fabric is constructed as a grid, they say, with horizontal and vertical threads interwoven. It's fundamentally and all the way down striated, and is consequently homogeneous. On the other hand, felt is constructed by a kind of mashing together of fibres, which become locally tangled with one another. It is, Deleuze and Guattari say, anti-fabric, a smooth space. Gritstone, which is a coarse sedimentary sandstone found only in the local hills, is more like felt, it seems to me. It's a smooth space par excellence, opposed to striation. Of course, there are many ways in which gritstone has been striated. Economically, grit has been quarried for building materials for centuries, and it is in the region's now obsolete quarries that many of us choose to climb. Culturally, it's been adopted as an emblem for the north of England, tough, or as symbolising courage or strength, having true grit. In climates, it is striated in many respects. The criteria for doing the route, which points of reference, which handholds, which footholds. The route itself is represented. Think about route guidebooks, topo diagrams, fixing the coordinates of the correct line to take. But what these striations don't often convey is the intensive locality, a mood, a feeling, a moment, a texture, or a time of day. Deleuze and Guattari start by saying everything, that is to say every intensive locality, for example, an actual occasion or experience, is an assemblage on a plane of consistency. Assemblages are connections of things that can be put together in new and perhaps unexpected ways. They can be collective or a locus of an immaterial expression, for example, the roots or events behind an actual event or moment of experience. They can also be material or machinic, corporeal, bodily. For example, in Architectures of Time, Sanford Quinter argues, quote, unlike more traditional hunter-warrior model sports, in which the task is to master in the macho, form-imposing sense, free soloist climbers do not conceive of themselves as exclusive or prime motors, at the origin of their movements. They rather track from within the flows, a variety of emerging features, singularities and unfoldings with which they can meld. Now to the relationship between re and decoding and re and deterritorialisation in smooth and striated space. How does it function? What makes it possible to pass from one social formation into another? Well, for a start, there are no, according to Deleuze and Guattari anyway, no interstate, that is to say, static relations between separate and discrete things as such. Here, Deleuze and Guattari introduce another concept, that of lines, and we might also look here at Tim Ingold's recent little book of the same title, which I thought was a marvellous little book. I quite like little books. I don't like large books, so Deleuze is quite difficult for me. Certainly a couple of those books. What does this mean? Deleuze and Guattari propose that we understand social formations by looking at the lines that compose them, the lines that run through them, and which leak or flow from them. For Deleuze and Guattari, social formations are codes of flows, a kind of globalising system of striations or structures that block or lock down free-flowing movements. But there are also networks of lines and intersocial movements that problematise the system, or problematise the rules of the game or centres. In other words, that depart from the norm and have local rather than global points of resonance. For example, in my own example of management studies, basic organisational models, structures and lines of communication often betray other important and less rigid forms of structure, such as informal work groups and office culture, which often contravene formal rules, but nonetheless govern the means by which thought, perception, feeling and expression are shaped. These supple lines open up flows that flee. They slip away and leak out from the social codes that seek to channel and to block them. In Lines of Flight, we try and set the flows of free solo rock climbing on the hills of the local Pennine region against the deadening or else paranoid organisation of work in the neighbouring industrial towns and cities. Our aim is not so much simply to foreclose on the decoded flows of solo rock climbing versus the more systematically coded structures of work. On the one hand, we can't flee coded structures completely. We would simply dissolve. Fleeing from codes has limits and tends always toward recoding. I guess in a climbing example, what was once, a generation ago, quite a pure form of extracurricular expression has now been arguably commodified as much as anything else has in the world. It's also almost a new skiing. Everyone wears the same labels, the same shoes, the same fashions, go to the same cliffs as well, come to think of it. At the same time, the structures are only temporary. They leak and have to be constantly tended to in order to avoid dissolution. As such, lines of flight offer an assemblage of flows and codes of all kinds, historical periods, material objects, and the hopes and fears of people in the course of their social, economic, and cultural lives. Finally, something about the relationship between the film and Deleuze's work, certainly his early work on cinema. How does our little film help us properly to represent our experience of these past, present, and future events? For Henri Bergson, reality is an open whole, an ever-changing, evolving state of affairs that can't be apprehended without an intuitive grasp of what is flowing by. For him, our image of reality is more significant than that which the idealist calls a representation, but it's also less than which the realist would call a thing, i.e. something totally out there and independent of our own perception. As such, what we perceive of reality is less than there actually is. We don't see all the minute detail. Instead, we subtract and abstract due to the forces of habit and expectation. In other words, our brains are screens that filter out that which we don't need, or which no longer has any interest for us. We become very good at reading between the lines because we know what to expect. Because of this, our perception and our memory becomes situated or normalised. Our perception englobes us, or wraps around us, as Ronald Bogue, I think, says. I remain at the centre of events because I've filtered out anything that might disturb my perceptual habits and expectations. In Lines of Flight, our aim partly is to disturb some of these habits and expectations, to recover the instability of our sense-making by borrowing what in matter and memory Bergson calls the vitality of our immediate experience and intuition. Despite his critique of cinema, that film might never represent the indeterminacy of immediate experience, Bergson seems to have been drawn to its possibilities nonetheless. He indicates this when he remarks how the cinematic experience is, like memory, composed of a series of images. Immobile, it's in a neutral state. In movement, it is life itself. According to Deleuze, it was toward the primitive imitation of motion by early mechanistic cinema that the Bergsonian critique was directed. Nonetheless, Deleuze claims film embodies exactly the intuitive grasp of mobile reality that Bergson denied it. Deleuze's logic of the movement image, where the image on the screen explicitly suggests an open hole beyond it, rather than the image in movement per se, indeed seems to me to approach Bergson's theory of memory and perception. For Bergson, true memory, quote, laden with the whole of the past, responds to the appeal of the present state. It moves in its entirety to meet the experience. It turns toward the situation of the moment. I guess following Bergson, we try and use images explicitly to suggest the open whole of events beyond those on the screen. We try to give experience a fresh nuance in the presence of a spectacle that really is lived in. In doing so, and here we also follow Deleuze and Guattari, our aim is not so much to narrate or to represent a scene or situation from past life, or events ongoing. This is impossible precisely because reality, moment to moment, is an ever-changing, evolving state of affairs. Rather, what we try to do is produce an encounter in the present moment, one that is sincerely experienced by the viewer, a plot that happens in the creation of the film. Perhaps, in other words, a kind of Bergsonian notion of fabulation. This is the purpose in using film, to achieve a kind of self-reflective perception, like that described by both Bergson and Deleuze, using movement images which offer us striking perceptions while also bringing us back to our own experience. And on the one hand here, whilst our film, I don't think, challenges any notions of classic cinema as Deleuze would see it, in that we make use of shots and cuts and montage in a rather straightforward way, or in the sense that Bergson's notion of the sensory motor schema is never challenged. I hope nonetheless that we've created some sort of tension or at least an instability, let me put it like that, of our, over our sense of the situation. One that might strip away or begin to strip away some of our sensory motor expectations. For example, can you make sense of, do they fit into your schema, the notions, the images of climbing that are about to appear? Either way, as you watch the film, I'd simply ask that you reflect on how you recognise yourself. What passions and compassions are invoked by watching the film? What intensities run from the film to your own lives? What lines did you follow as the viewer? Where do you find your orientation and happiness in a capitalist society when the goal is always more? I'll leave it at that.